I called you on the day of the announcement of your Nobel Prize, in the aftermath of your hearing the news.
Yes, it was pretty hectic.
I think Petrona was actually cutting your hair at the same time.
That's correct, she did. Well, she used to cut people's hair. She had expertise in that area, yes.
Well, she sent us a couple of very beautiful photographs of you standing on your balcony. And so we could see with our own eyes that she'd done a good job. So.
Yes, I think she did, yes.
Roger Penrose spent many months of the pandemic in isolation. While on the one hand that meant having to get haircuts in the kitchen, on the other hand it gave him time to contemplate some of the questions that he continues to grapple with. He shared some of his thoughts in this chat from Season 2 of the podcast, and I very much hope you enjoy this Encore presentation.
I'm very bad at giving up. I know Stephen Hawking was that way. I remember describing how determined he was about things.
That was 2020 physics laureate Roger Penrose. And this is Nobel Prize Conversations.
I give up if I realise they're wrong. That happens, certainly.
British mathematician and physicist Roger Penrose was awarded the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work which showed that black holes are a direct consequence of the general theory of relativity. In December 2020, he received his Nobel medal and diploma at a ceremony in London, not Stockholm. It was one of the few times he's left his home in the past year, where he's been in isolation due to the coronavirus pandemic. Nobel Prize Conversations is produced with the support of our Nobel International partners, 3M, ABB, Ericsson and Scania. Your host is Adam Smith, Chief Scientific Officer at Nobel Prize Outreach. Adam reached Penrose by phone in the solitude of his home in Oxford and began by asking him how his experience of lockdown has been.
Yes, well, I don't think we can say too much about the future at this present stage, but I mean, the vaccine presumably will reduce the thing considerably, and so maybe it'll be all right to travel. I'm quite happy about not travelling, actually. I mean, I had an enormous number of appointments occupying almost the entire year, which never took place.
Yes, and so more time to think, although you don't seem to be short of time to think, but...
Well, I was doing a lot of that before. You see, I was doing quite well until the Nobel Prize came along, and then and then it rather got put on hold for a while, the things I was thinking about. No, I was taking advantage of lockdown to develop some ideas which I'd thought about a bit before, but not really to the extent I was able to, because all these travels were cancelled and so on.
Mm. But in general, are you good at clearing the decks to give yourself space?
Well, not in the literal sense. My decks over here, I can see all stacked up with papers and things like that. But in the sense I think you mean, I don't know if it's ever cleared like that. There's so many things going on which involve thinking about different things that it's not too easy to develop particular ideas that I've been trying to work on. Well, there are about 3 of them, you see, that's the trouble. Well, one of them is a book which I keep putting off, using the pictures, the prints and paintings of the artist M.C. Escher to illustrate various mathematical themes. So I have a contract with my publisher to write this book, but I'd done almost nothing about it except give a couple of talks in which I explained the sort of thing I had intended to do.
The surreal works of Dutch graphic artist M.C. Escher won him a reputation as a master of illusions. Escher's work captured Roger Penrose's imagination as soon as he first encountered it when visiting an exhibition in the Netherlands, and the 1958 paper that Penrose wrote with his father Lionel, called Impossible Objects, a special type of visual illusion, was in part a result of that visit. That paper, which introduced the famous Penrose triangle, also contained an illustration of an endless staircase that became known as the Penrose stairs. The paper eventually found its way back to Escher. Closing the circle, these Penrose stairs inspired Escher's famous 1960 drawing Ascending and Descending, in which its subjects climb eternally upwards and downwards on an impossible four-sided staircase. Let's hear some more about Roger Penrose's new book, and whether he thinks Escher might also have been a master of mathematics.
This sounds a lovely book and a continuation of this long-standing relationship with Escher's work, because it was his work that inspired you first to come up with the Penrose triangle, wasn't it?
It was. That's quite right, yes. It was very curious, because later I realized what it was. There's some people, I don't remember if it was the BBC or something, it was quite a long time ago, where they had a program which was supposed to be on twistor theory, which is something, it's quite technical mathematics, and quite why they thought it would make good program for the general public, I wasn't sure. But anyway, they were making this thing, and then what was it? Yes, they asked me, what good is it, you see? And I said, well, one of the things it can do is to solve Maxwell's equations, the equations which, govern electricity, magnetism, and my ability to speak to you at the moment, and so on, all sorts of things, radio waves, and X-rays, and all these things. And so I said, well, yes, the twistor theory is you can solve Maxwell's equation. They say, well, how do you do this? And so I said, well, it's an idea I can't really explain. It wouldn't be appropriate for this program. They say, oh, well, what's that? Well, it's called cohomology. They say, oh, well, couldn't you explain that? No, there's no way I could possibly explain that. And then the next day, as I woke up in the morning, I thought of an idea, namely the impossible triangle, which is an illustration of cohomology. You see, locally, it makes sense, but you don't know how far away from the eye. So if you look just a corner of the triangle, say, it could be closer or it could be further away if you're drawing a picture of it, you see. Mm-hmm. So that you have that freedom. And having that freedom, you can go around the symbol, around the triangle here, and produce a contradiction. The way you characterize this contradiction is in terms of what's called cohomology. That describes the degree of impossibility, actually, in the picture. So I realized that it was actually an illustration of that, but they didn't use it. But it did seem that that's something that one could use, because a lot of Escher pictures, I could see lots of things that you could illustrate using Escher's. And I had thought of, having one chapter on this topic, one chapter on that topic, one chapter on another. But then you find that the Escher picture, which best illustrates the first topic, also illustrates the second topic and maybe the third topic at the same time. So he crams so many of these things all at once into a single picture. And it makes the organization extremely difficult.
I suppose as a starting point for people to start to think about the mathematics, the pictures would be lovely points of reference.
I think the idea was to start off and show what these pictures illustrate mathematically, and then maybe say a little bit which goes beyond them, and then for the rest of it just give references. Mm. So that's the way I think we would plan to do it. For example, there are lots of these tessellations with animals and creatures and people and so on, which illustrate various symmetries. And there are these 17 different symmetry groups which are illustrated. Escher does illustrate each one of those, which is very striking. And this would lead on to these things which I've been doing, which are not periodic. You see, they look as though they're periodic, and you only have a small number of pieces which you fit together. And Escher would have absolutely made hay with this if he'd been alive. He unfortunately died. He died about the same time as my father did, and neither of them were able to see this, which was always a great regret for me.
That's a shame. So this is things like the Penrose tiling pattern, the fivefold. So yeah. Did Escher himself understand the mathematics behind his patterns?
I think he did. You see, he always said that he was very bad at mathematics or something, but who knows what that means. he clearly understood it. You can look at these pictures. Take, for example, one that I did use in the Nobel lecture, actually, which is one of the things called circle limits. And you see these angels and devils. Unless I use the fish, I can't remember if I use the fish or the angels and devils. But anyway, you see them interlocking and forming this pattern. And you look at the pattern, and you see the angels and devils get smaller and smaller as you get towards the edge.
It was the fish, I think.
It was the fish. Okay, yes. So the fish gets smaller and smaller as you get towards the edge. But in the geometry that they are inhabiting, they don't think they're smaller. They think they're the same size as the ones in the middle. But this is what's called a conformal representation. So you squash them down in all directions by the same amount. Another way of saying this is that angles, if you see the fish have a certain angle on its fin, then that angle is going to be exactly the same no matter how small it is. And you see how precisely Escher has done this, right down to the very edge, and you can see the tiny little fish right there, and they're all extremely precisely done according to this prescription. Now, you can't do that without understanding something of the mathematics. So he clearly did. I consider that he was a mathematician. He just never sort of admitted to it.
When he was growing up, Penrose's parents hoped he would pursue medical research instead of mathematics. But it turned out that a sort of academic accident prevented it. We'll hear more about that later. But first, Roger Penrose tells us how sharing a common interest in geometry with his father Lionel Penrose, a leading researcher in medical genetics in the 1950s, helped create an uncommon father and son publishing team.
So you mentioned that you're sad your father didn't see for instance, your tiling pattern. And it was with him that you published a joint paper, this original triangle. It's fascinating that you were, in a sense, colleagues with your father as well as being father and son. It's an unusual relationship.
Yes. Well, we wrote more than one. That was one paper we wrote together. We wrote another one together, which was, I would say, that paper that was more my contribution than his, in a sense. Although he developed the staircase from what he developed all sorts of buildings which were impossible in one way or another, and then he came up with the staircase. And we then sent the paper to Escher. We'd given reference to the catalogue to the museum exhibition in Amsterdam, where I'd seen the Eschers for the first time. And he then had a bit of correspondence with my father. And then I travelled, when I was on, I think I was a lecture tour or something in the Netherlands, and I telephoned Escher. My father had his phone number. And he invited me and my then wife to tea, and I talked to him for a bit, and then he had these two piles of prints, one on either side of him. There was a long table. I was at one end of the table, and he was at the other. And he said, these one on his left, he said, I'm very short of these. The ones on the right, you can choose one. So he just pushed them over to me, and I leafed through them, and I thought, my God, I've got to choose one of these. Now, which one on earth can I choose? So I picked one out, which I thought I'd never seen before. And he was very pleased I picked that one out, because he said, well, people don't usually understand that one. So I thought that was quite flattering.
It was a test, yes. Well done, you passed.
Yes, you could think it was a test, yes.
Did Escher's house look like an Escher drawing?
Well, you see, that was the thing. My father kept saying, oh, well, you'll see his house, there will be staircases going out of the window. On the contrary, it was a very organised, very neat, well organised and neat. You might expect that for him, with a huge picture window, I seem to remember. But it was nothing extraordinary or, impossible about his house, at least not that I could see anyway.
In this relationship with your father, did you always feel like colleagues from when you were young? Were you sort of joint intelligences?
I think it goes way back. I remember most particularly, you see, we spent the war years in Canada. We went over to Canada just before the Second World War. My father, we went over to the US first. He had something in Philadelphia. And then we moved to London, Ontario in Canada, where we stayed I think the war broke out I can't remember exactly when, but we were certainly over on the American continent at that time, North American continent. And I remember at one point, yes, this is something in particular. It wasn't probably the only thing, but I remember this in particular. I noticed that either it was a floor or a kitchen tabletop. I have a feeling it was a kitchen tabletop or something, which was tessellated with little hexagons. So there were little white hexagons, and it was tessellated out of those. So I asked my father, look, suppose this pattern went on and on and on and on, could it close up and cover a sphere? That's what I said to him.
If you don't mind me saying so, that's a hell of a question for an 8-year-old or even someone a little older.
Anyway, so that's what I said. Can it close up and make a sphere? And he said, no, but you can do it with pentagons. That was the way it came about. That's right. And so then he told me about a dodecahedron. And so we spent a lot of time making polyhedra and different kinds, truncated ones as well and all this. And so we made quite a lot of these things. So this we certainly did together.
That's lovely, but having your inquisitiveness inform each other.
That's interesting, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes, I had a very close relation to my father in that respect. You see, he had a close relation to my two other brothers in a different respect. I was always supposed to be the medical one. Both my parents were medical, and they'd given up on my older brother, Oliver. He was obviously just going to be a mathematician or a physicist or something, and they'd given up on Jonathan because he was just interested in playing chess or other games. And they concluded that I would be the one to carry on the medical career, which I thought myself too. And when back in England, I guess I'd had 2 years. It was going on for the final 2 years there. And each one of us had to go up to the headmaster to say what we would do in our final 2 years. And I remember as I was walking up to the desk, I was going to be a doctor. So he said to me, what subjects do you want to do in your last 2 years? And so I said, I'd like to do biology, chemistry, and mathematics. And he said, no, you can't do that combination. If you want to do mathematics, you can't do biology. If you want to do biology, you can't do mathematics. But then, since I couldn't do biology, I said mathematics, physics, and chemistry. Because at that point, I simply didn't want to lose the maths. I loved maths. And I was sort of lukewarm about biology. So I just didn't want to lose the mathematics. And so there my medical career went down the tubes, right, in a flash. And when I went home, I got into real trouble with my parents. They said, well, you've been keeping bad company, they said, because one of my best friends wanted to be a nuclear physicist. And to them, this was about the worst thing you could do because nuclear bombs. You see, they were both sort of pacifists. Well, my father was a Quaker. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't approve of bombs and things like that. And so they thought I'd been keeping bad company. It was nothing to do with that at all. It's just the math.
Oh, that sort of teenage rebellion was the sort of thing that most people had to deal with. But
then he got one of the teachers, one of the lecturers at the college, and he was an amazing person. I don't know how he did this, but he made up, I think it was either 6 or 12, it may even have been 12, specially made up problems that were unusual in some way or another. And he said, well, look, he gave me this problem. He said, well, you may only be able to do 1 or 2, but see how you get on by the end of the day. And I remember did a lot, you see. And I gave him to him, and he was pretty impressed with that. So he thought maybe he told my father, and then my father sort of gave in.
Lovely stories. But how odd that, in fact, maybe maths would have had its way anyway, but at least when you met the headmaster, that an accident of timetabling pushed you further towards maths.
Yes, later on I would have been able to do biology and maths. You could have done both, yes. But at that time, they were sort of too foreign to each other, yes. Yes, it is. That was certainly an accident of the way things were at that time, yes.
You've mentioned earlier that you're working on 3 things at once at the moment, and you do have this lovely diversity. I was interested in how you keep these balls in the air? Do you work on one problem for a while and then decide you've got a bit of a way with that and then put it aside when you focus on another? Because I assume that each of these requires a deal of concentration and an unbroken thought.
I think it is something like that. But you see, they are sort of connected on the whole. I mean, in effect, the least clearly connected is the non-periodic tilings, although that is an illustration of a non-computable problem. You see, the tiling problem, I mean, that was an interest of mine. Yes, that was another interest of mine. Well, you see, it goes back in a way to when I was a graduate student in Cambridge. Well, it goes back earlier than that, but when I was a graduate student in Cambridge, and I was supposed to be doing pure mathematics. I was supposed to be doing algebraic geometry under Hodge. And I thought, well, there's a lot of time. I can go to other lectures which might interest me. And so I went to Bondi's lectures on general relativity and cosmology. I went to Dirac's lectures on quantum mechanics, the great physicist Paul Dirac, on quantum mechanics, and I went to a lecture course by a man called Steen on mathematical logic. And they each played a role, you see. When the mathematical logic one, that's where I learned about Gödel's theorem, and I remember talking about mathematical logic when I was an undergraduate, actually, to a colleague of mine. This was Ian Percival, who also became later a physicist and a fellow of the Royal Society. But we used to talk about all sorts of things, and mathematical logic was one of them. And I'd heard about Gödel's theorem, and I thought it said there were certain things in mathematics you couldn't prove, and I didn't like that idea. But then I went to Steen's course, and he explained it very clearly. It was that if you have any particular system which you regard as proofs of mathematical theorems in one certain class of, say about number theory, certain set of axioms and rules of procedures, then what Gödel shows is that you can produce a particular statement which you can see is true by virtue of the meaning of the statement and your trust in the rules that you're allowed to use to prove things. So the fact that you are constrained to a certain system, and if you trust that system to give you only truths, then you can produce a statement which you can see by virtue of your trust that the system only gives you truths, is true, nevertheless is not derivable by means of by the system. And I thought that was absolutely stunning, because it told me that there is something in our thinking, our understanding, which is not computational. And then I started wondering, well, what can it be? Okay, I was very much a physicalist. I didn't believe there's some mysterious who's it, what's it comes in and makes us do things which aren't physics. I thought it's physics of some kind, but what can it be? And I knew about Newtonian mechanics, and I knew about Einstein's general relativity from Bondi. I thought it would be pretty difficult to put on a computer, but we now know you can do things like these LIGO simulations of black holes spiraling into each other, and you can see the signals in the LIGO detector. So it's clear you can put that on a computer. What about quantum mechanics? Well, I remember hearing Dirac's first lecture. And his first lecture, I think it was his first one, and he talked about the superposition principles. He said a particle can be here and it can be there, and it can be here and there at the same time. And then he took out a piece of chalk, and people tell me he broke it in two, I think. And he would say, what about this piece of chalk? This could be here and there. And then my mind wandered, and I was looking out of the window and thinking about something else. And then when my concentration came back to the lecture, he'd gone on to the next thing. I had in mind that he'd said something about how much energy it would cost for something. I didn't know what it was. And that puzzled me ever since, that whatever it is that collapses the wave function must be a physics which is beyond computation. And that physics, since it's beyond computation, should be the physics which is taken advantage of by our conscious brains. So it was that viewpoint which I formulated. This was a viewpoint. I didn't think much about it until much, much later.
So the seed sown as an undergraduate was waiting for the right conditions to flourish.
Was really waiting for the first sort of popular book I wrote, well, semi-popular, I suppose you call it, The Emperor's New Mind.
Roger Penrose's book, The Emperor's New Mind, concerning computers, minds and the laws of physics, was released in 1989. The theories that he presents in it are considered controversial, and Penrose's ideas have both fans and opponents. As you'll hear, Penrose argues that by its very nature, human consciousness isn't possible to model using digital computers. How does he think the human mind works then? Well, this is where neurophysiology meets physics.
I had in mind that I would write a book which was really explaining all the wonderful things that I'd learnt about physics and mathematics, or a few of them, I should say, but aimed, in a sense, to seeing what it could be that could be beyond computation, thinking that whatever human understanding is something beyond computation. And how could it be? And what could be going on in the brain that might be taking advantage of the collapse of the wave function? You see, that was a view I'd held for a long time. I don't remember quite when I formulated that view, but it was certainly as a result of the combination of Steen's lectures and Dirac's lectures. But I thought, well, I would wait till I was retired and have enough time to write a book. But then I remember hearing a discussion between Marvin Minsky and Edward Fredkin, in which they were being very computationalist and talking about these two computers talking to each other, and as you walk up to the other end of the room, they would have communicated with each other more ideas than the entire human race. And I thought, well, I see where you're coming from, but I don't believe you. The ideas are something else, you see. And so I didn't believe that it was computation. This really stimulated me to start writing this book, The Emperor's New Mind. And there I thought, well, I learned a bit about neurophysiology, and maybe we'll understand how there could be anything like preserving quantum coherence at the right level. And I failed, because all I learned about was the Hodgkin-Huxley nerve transmission. It seemed to me there was another hope in hell. You see, I wrote the book anyway with some kind of vague excuse at the end. And Stuart Hameroff read my book, and he says he was very interested, but he gathers that I didn't know about microtubules. So he came on and explained to me microtubules, and I thought, now they have a much, much better chance. So we had our collaboration from then on. So that's one area that you see, I don't do much on that area because that is the biology, and I don't really, biology is beyond me mostly. I just sort of hear what other people say.
But on this word belief, plays an interesting role. I mean, you have a kind of scientific belief in things like quantum mechanics, which some people hold very fast to. But I was interested that you used the word that you just didn't believe that, you know, that computers could replicate the processes that are happening in the mind. And it's based on some sort of feeling which has guided you often, I think. I think you often have this kind of belief structure that guides you.
You're right. It's very difficult, of course, because it's such an intangible thing. It's very hard to say what that is. But it is something to do with... See, I like to use the word understanding, but probably that's a bit limited. You see, when I talk about the Gödel thing, see, what it is, it has to know what the symbols mean. And to know what the symbols mean enables one to do things that it can't do without knowing what it means. I mean, it's a very subtle thing. And people kind of think, oh, well, you just, put it on a computer and give it a zillion, it knows what a smile means because you give it 1,000 pictures of people, or 1 million of them, and some of them smile and some don't. I don't know, things like that. I mean, if it's doing it just by experience and no understanding, which is ultimately how we came about anyway, because natural selection is like that. So there is something which comes about through just trying all sorts of things and seeing which one works best without understanding. But we get to a level through the evolution which gave us whatever brains we have and gave them this quality of understanding, which it doesn't know anything about, if I can put it that way. But the quality of understanding is something physical. I mean, it depends on something physical, which I claim to be what's involved in the collapse of the wave function. I mean, it is a view which I held from quite early on, which was putting together the Gödel thing and in Dirac's lectures, basically, and that there is something which is not covered by the equations of quantum. You see, the equations of quantum mechanics are inconsistent with themselves, because you have an equation, which is the Schrödinger equation. It's a perfectly clear equation. You could put that on a computer. It's pretty difficult to do because you have enormous numbers of parameters often. But nevertheless, it is computational. Yet, that's not the whole story. And it's not what nature does. Because if nature followed the Schrödinger equation, as Schrödinger was very, very clear to point out himself, you could produce a state which is a cat which was dead and alive at the same time. And he produced this example to show the absurdity of our understanding of quantum mechanics. Many people take it the other way. They say, oh, yes, well, we could make a cat which was, maybe it's not a cat, but it could be a big thing which we put in two places at once and so on, without pointing out the absurdity, which is what Schrödinger was really trying to express. And he and Einstein and Dirac himself, quite remarkably, I only learned that relatively late in life, believed that quantum mechanics needed fixing. That as it stands, it's an inconsistent. They were much too polite to call it inconsistent. They used to call it incomplete. I'm not quite so polite, and I call it inconsistent, because the reduction of the state, or the collapse of the wave function, is inconsistent with the Schrödinger equation. It just does not follow the Schrödinger equation. So either you've got to do one of these crazy routes and go along many worlds. You say all these worlds exist simultaneously in some, and then you have to explain why we don't experience the other ones and so on. So it doesn't really make much help. It doesn't help you really. But all these different people get tied up in knots about trying to interpret quantum mechanics. Whereas my view is you don't interpret it, you change it. And you change it in a way which is beyond, just not that far beyond, but beyond current experiments. There is an experiment which has been performed by Dirk Baumeister. When I say performed, he's been working towards performing it. And last time I saw him, he was giving it about a couple of years, so which is about 1 year from now. So we'll have to cross fingers and see if he's right. But he's been pretty good on his timescale prediction, which is unusual for experimental physicists. So maybe we will see an answer to this, that you would see, if it is what I claim to be a gravitational effect, then you would begin to see it in these experiments. So we're just on the sort of borderline of experiments which, of course, it might not be gravitational, but it seems to be gravitational is by far the best candidate, because you can see it's inconsistent with quantum mechanics in quite simple situations. So there is a problem. At least I should say the basic principles are inconsistent with each other. So there's something's got to go.
Well, yes. I mean, fundamentally, at the level of the black hole, for which you were, the research for which you were awarded the Nobel Prize, there's a fundamental inconsistency between gravity and quantum mechanics.
There is indeed. This is the thing that people call, I don't know if you're referring to the same thing, but there is a thing that people call the information paradox. It's remarkable that most physicists that I know go along the quantum route, which they shouldn't do, in my view. You see, in the black hole, it really comes from Stephen Hawking's black hole evaporation thing. The fact that the black holes, they swallow information. And then when they evaporate away, according to Hawking evaporation, what happens to the information that they swallow? Well, maybe it goes into the radiation, maybe it goes destroyed on the singularity, but it gets lost, whichever way. Well, no, what gets destroyed on the singularity gets lost. Some of it may come out in the radiation, and there's a big argument about how much does, but some has to get lost on the singularity. So you do have to violate the information conservation, which means violating unitarity, which means violating the Schrödinger equation. So, yes, black holes must violate the Schrödinger equation. I think that's pretty clear. But No, when I say it's pretty clear, it's not pretty clear, because many physicists believe it can't. I'm sorry, it's clear to me, but it's not clear to other people. You see, they think, I don't know, I can't understand. They're just so wedded to unitarity. When I say unitarity, that's what I mean. It's in simple-minded, well, it is a Schrödinger equation. It means that the evolution follows this equation, yeah. And so you can't lose information. The Schrödinger equation doesn't lose information. So how does it do it? And Schrödinger himself was modest enough to say that his equation has to be not the answer to these issues. There's something else going on.
Again, it comes back to this question of a kind of belief, a kind of adherence to a scientific philosophy that people seem very willing to buy into. And I'm sure for good reason, but I don't know whether you think that it's to the service of physics in general that people feel so strongly about their particular thing, whether it's string theory or whatever.
I mean, I think it's a necessary feature. You see, sort of commitment that people have to their ideas, which enables them to delve into them sufficiently to explore them fully, which, if they didn't, you might never know, even if it's wrong. And then you can find out it's wrong. At least you'd hope to, although that doesn't necessarily happen. Yeah.
That's a good answer.
So I think that's plus. But what's the minus is that people so infrequently can be deflected from this sort of view. I remember Dennis Sharma, he was Stephen Hawking's supervisor. He was also my mentor, I would guess you call it. He was not a supervisor of mine, but I did learn an awful lot of physics from him. He somehow picked up on me and decided he was going to teach me physics. Well, I can remember the occasion which persuaded him on that. But it was, yes. But anyway, we used to do things like drive to Stratford and watch the plays, and as we did, he would talk very animatedly about various things which excited me very much. He was very much a physicist and not a mathematician. But he was a great proponent of the steady-state model, this model of cosmology in which the universe expanded, yes, but new matter was created in the form of hydrogen, and this matter replenished the matter that disappeared from the expansion, or went out of the horizon and disappeared. And so that model, it arose for a very good reason originally, because there was a mistake in people's estimations of the age of the universe. There are clusters of stars called globular clusters, and they are very old. It's in the dynamics, so you can work out that they're very old. And they seem to be older than the age of the universe, earlier than the Big Bang, which is impossible because there wasn't anything, according to the standard view, before the Big Bang. So how did these globular clusters manage to be so old? And it came about because there was a mistake in people's estimate of the age of the universe. It depended on confusing two different kinds of Cepheid variable stars. There were two different kinds, and people got confused between the two, and they'd worked out that the universe was younger than it actually is, well, time from the Big Bang, that is. Mm-hmm. So when that was discovered to be wrong, then the microwave background was discovered by Penzias and Wilson, and this was a good evidence for this very, very early, very, very hot stage in the universe. Now, what I'm trying to get to was Dennis Sharma, who was this very strong proponent of steady states and went around lecturing about it all over the world. As soon as he got convinced that Penzias and Wilson was right, he changed, and he would give lectures to say, I was wrong. The steady state model is wrong. It doesn't hold up. We now have to study the Big Bang theory. And I was extremely impressed by that, for somebody who could be so committed to one view, and then when the experiments show that the view is wrong, he changed his mind.
That's honesty, isn't it?
That was real honesty, yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, rather rare. But I think it's relating to your question. I mean, you see, people get so committed in the things that they follow that they somehow refuse to accept if it's not going to work.
Well, I suppose one problem, perhaps more now than before, but I don't know if that's the case, is that your career, your standing, your profile is all tied up in the stories you're telling. And
maybe, yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Yes, then is the story, yes.
I don't know. I mean, maybe such honesty has always been rare, and maybe it's always been thus. But or perhaps these days people are more sensitive to not being, I don't know, proved wrong.
You see, here me being sort of too committed to my own views, although I changed my view here, you see. Yeah. You see, it was very interesting because you know Stephen Sackur, who interviews people. And he somehow very early got hold, when I very early thought about the CCC, the Conformal Cyclic Cosmology, whereas previously, I'd been talking about the Big Bang and Stephen Hawking had been developing my theorems in the direction of cosmology and showing they apply to the Big Bang too, and so on. And we got together with a theorem which encompassed the ones we'd done before and so on. And then when I don't know where he got it from, but Stephen Sackur had got hold of the fact that I had changed my mind. And we went into his studio, I think, and he told me as we were walking in, he said, usually I interview politicians, and I take an aggressive view with them. I sort of argue with them, tell them, I'm going to have to do that with you. I just thought I'd better warn you. So in the middle of this discussion, he said, why did you change your mind? And I think I said, well, I think, I'm trying to be a scientist, and therefore if the evidence points another way, then I should go the other way. I can't remember what I said exactly. Presumably there's record of it somewhere, but it was something like that.
Well, presumably this was one of his hard talk interviews. Well, bold of him to take you on, I suppose.
I was very impressed with him, I must say. I mean, because most of my colleagues didn't even know about this idea. I hadn't talked about it. I think I'd squeezed it into the end of lectures I'd given occasionally. Just, well, here's an idea or something like that. It wasn't until considerably later, when a talk I gave in Cambridge, where I did put it forward in a sort of serious way. He picked it up before that, which I thought was very remarkable.
For those of us who who struggle to maintain focus on one idea at a time, what advice do you have for how to keep focused? Because I imagine for you, you must get distracted all the time by nice possibilities.
I have to blame the Nobel Prize for it partly, because I was just sort of almost finished with a section of these notes which I've been sending out to colleagues. This is on the collapse of the wave function. I was trying to develop ideas. It was the COVID-19 which had sort of prevented me from traveling around the world, and therefore I was concentrate on it. Was really notes to people. It wasn't really an article as such, or a book, or what. I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I just want people's reactions. So I sent them out to, ended out about 30 people I sent them out to. And I got some quite not very many people responded, but quite a few with interesting ideas, which developed what I was thinking about. And then I had some idea. I think somebody suggested to me, well, you have to have an experimental mental test because there's a certain curious kind of retroactivity in it, which really you have to bend your mind around rather about. And so I said, well, look, maybe there's an experiment. And so I figured out this experiment, which curiously enough seems to indicate that the conventional way of looking at quantum mechanics gives you the right answer, whereas most of the models which try to model it, try to modify it, give you the wrong answer. And so, I was trying to put it forward as something which gives the right answer in my scheme, but I realized afterwards that the conventional way of looking at quantum mechanics gives you the same answer as mine does, which maybe is a good thing. But I was in the middle of writing that, and then the Nobel Prize thing came along, and so I've not got any further with it since then. But I really do need to go back to it. But you're asking me, how do I keep these things in mind at once? I don't know.
Well, yes. Yes, I mean, that's the thing, that how do you, given that that I imagine on a daily basis, you can't help but think a little bit about consciousness and then a little bit about, I don't know, cosmology. How do you sublimate the cosmology and keep concentrated on the consciousness?
I think it is more that one comes in and the others take a back seat. I mean, there's a rumbling which goes on, it's true, and the ideas which... So I may be talking to somebody about something on the consciousness thing which rings a little bell about one of the other topics. That can happen, yes. I think that can happen. But there's not much sort of deep thinking about the other topics. But it's difficult to know, what does deep thinking do? I find so much I deep think about something and I just go along the same lines every time. So it's really something needs to come in to change the way you're thinking about something. And it may be an idea from a different topic. So that sometimes does happen, yes.
Yes, because on our call just on the day of the Nobel Prize announcement, you mentioned that lovely story of the essential idea occurring to you as you were crossing a road. And, you never know when these things will pop in. So I suppose it's just being receptive to that happening and then having a good enough memory to realise what's just happened.
Well, therefore, that was the one which rather almost got lost. I had another one more recently, which I was afraid it was going to get lost, but I managed to retrieve it, fortunately. But that one, yes, the trapped surface idea for the black holes, yes, that was the one that won the Nobel Prize. I had no idea at the time, of course. Now, I had been thinking about the kinds of techniques. I just didn't see how to use them. Mm. And then Ivor Robinson, this colleague of mine, was talking away to me. He was a wonderful talker and wonderful stories had, and then we crossed the street and he stopped talking as we crossed the street, and this idea sort of surfaced and then disappeared again as we got to the other side, and I felt elated in some strange way, and so I had to retrieve what that idea was. I realized I had some thought. I'd had to work all the way through what I was doing in the day before I got to it.
Let me finish by asking one thing.
Yes.
Do you ever give up on a thought? Do you ever just think something is just beyond anybody's ken and you're just not going to bother with this one?
I'm very bad at giving up. It's true. I know Stephen Hawking was that way. I remember describing how determined he was about things. But it's true, I don't easily give up on things. I give up if I realize they're wrong. That happens, certainly. I had a completely crazy idea early on. Yes. I don't believe it anymore. But I tend to stick to these ideas, yes. I'm not very good at giving up on them. Well, I have ideas which I just, don't think there's much chance, but maybe I've got to... there's this problem of tiling the plane with a single shape, which forces non-periodicity. I did it with two shapes, you see. Is there a single shape? People call it an Einstein, you see, one stone. Can you produce an Einstein? So it only tiles periodically. And I had a sort of idea of how you might do this. And I sort of drew it up. And I have a blackboard in my bedroom, you see. Well, it's a whiteboard, yes, in my bedroom. And I'd drawn up these things to try and see if I could do it. See, I don't believe that's going to work, actually. But it's a thought which is worth exploring.
Fabulous.
That particular thought. Maybe there is an Einstein, but the particular concept of an Einstein I had, I think it's too far-fetched that it's not likely to work. But it has a chance. I would say that has probably about a 5% chance. But you see, when I had an idea, usually it's only about 50%. See, so people used to say when they have an idea, they know they're right, you see. I don't think it's ever quite like that. But it's an idea like the tiling one. You see, I had my pentagon tiling, and I'd drawn it out for a friend of mine who was in hospital to try and cheer her up a bit. And later on, I thought, looking at this pattern, is there a way of making it into a jigsaw puzzle? So you put little knobs and notches on the pieces and force that arrangement. Now, that, you see, you might call it an inspiration or something. It was true, but I was giving it about 50%. I think that's, if I have something which strikes me as a good idea, maybe has a 50% chance. I think when I thought CCC, the Conformal Cyclic Cosmology, I was giving it, say, 50%. That's not a very accurate 50. It could be 20 or 80.
Sure, but it's a lovely insight that it doesn't come as a ready-formed 100% right idea.
No, it doesn't. That's absolutely right. It's not a 100% certain idea. It needs thinking about. It's an idea which has got a chance. I'd say that's it. And it's different from ways of thinking before, and it has a chance, yes.
A lovely phrase, an idea that's got a chance. I like that. And the whiteboard in your bedroom is there because you wake up full of ideas, or
It is there for that reason, yes. I wouldn't put... Well, it's partly because I've got too many boards. You see, I have a blackboard which I've got in my study. And I've got a portable whiteboard, which is... I prop up if I want to do it in front of the screen, and I do something by Zoom or something. And I've got a very small one, which I sometimes use. And then I had this whiteboard, and I couldn't think where to put it, so I thought to put it in the bedroom. It's a little bit distracting, because I've got a picture on there which I don't think I should be thinking about. I should rub it out. It's just I don't think it's not an idea as such. It's just an exploring something.
I have to finish by asking whether there's something magic about the board rather than a pen and paper.
Which I much like. I like blackboards much the best. And I think they are better in a way. Whiteboards I'm not so keen on. But they're not so much worse than blackboards.
But it's something about the chalk?
There is something about how easy it is to change things. I think that's it. You put something out and you can modify it much more easily. See, if you draw something... Well, you could draw it in pencil and keep rubbing it out, but then in a little while your paper rips and that doesn't work. But on the blackboard, you can very easily sketch something out, use your hand to wipe it off. See, that's why it's superior to a whiteboard. I mean, you get your squirter and you have to do it, and then it drips all down the board, and you have to mop it up and so on. No, a blackboard is much better, because you can just wipe it out if you've got a cloth or your hand, and you can just modify a picture. Or if I have an equation, I can just take one term out in the middle and put in the right term, you see. Oh, yeah. No, blackboards are much better.
I can see online sales of blackboards surging as a result of this. Well, thank you so much. That's been a lovely, lovely conversation.
Well, I hope it's been helpful.
Oh, hugely, and hugely enjoyable, and fascinating. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, it's been my pleasure.
You've just heard Nobel Prize Conversations, a podcast series with Adam Smith by Filt for Nobel Prize Outreach. The producer for this episode was Sally Henriksen, and I'm Claire Brilliant. Music by Epidemic Sound. This episode is from Season 2 of the show. Don't miss our conversation with Penrose's co-laureate, the American astronomer and physicist Andrea Ghez. You can find that episode and all our previous seasons and conversations on Acast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.